everyone, this is Travis Wright. Welcome back to the Bare Metal to Private Cloud web conference series we've got going here. Today we've got a session on clustering Hyper-V and installing a highly available virtual machine manager cluster. So let's just dig right in here. Start with clustering Hyper-V. If you remember back to the last session, we talked about how we had set up the kind of baseline infrastructure for deploying a private cloud. We had a series of clusters here. We've got one cluster that we'll be using for clustering Hyper-V and running our virtual machines on there. We've got a file server cluster that we'll be using for the virtual machine manager library. We've got a SQL cluster that we'll be installing the System Center databases on. And we have a virtual machine manager cluster that we'll be installing the virtual machine manager server on today. And then just a couple of miscellaneous servers, a domain controller, and a jump box that allows us to connect into our isolated test environment here from the corporate network. So today we're going to actually set up all four of these clusters and just kind of blaze through that and understand exactly what it takes to set up these types of clusters as part of the infrastructure for private cloud. And just a reminder, we've got all of these clusters hooked up to a central SAN where we've provisioned a number of different LUNs on that SAN to store virtual machine files as well as SQL database and log files. And we have a LAN dedicated out from the SAN that will store all the library content on the file server cluster. So with that, let's just kind of go on and take a look at what it takes to install a Hyper-V cluster. So there's a number of steps to follow here. The first is to prepare the storage and present that storage to the hosts, and then prepare the host operating system, install Hyper-V on all the nodes of the cluster, and then add the failover clustering feature, and then create cluster storage volumes from those LUNs on the central storage. So let's go through these step by step. First of all, in terms of preparing the storage, we want to make sure that whatever storage we're using, whether it's a SAN or whatever, is certified for use with Windows Server 2008 R2. And we're going to want to create at least two LUNs on the SAN. The first LUN we'll create is a really small LUN that will be used for the witness or quorum drive. So each cluster that we have of the four clusters here, actually each one of them needs to have a witness or quorum drive that allows both of the, all of the nodes of the cluster to read and write from the configuration file there in order to be able to sort of communicate with each other. So what you want to do is just carve a small LUN out of the SAN, and when you add that in as a logical drive inside of the cluster nodes, typically people assign that to the Q drive. And then you'll also want to carve out some number of LUNs for storing virtual machine files, whether they be VHD files or the VM configuration files. You may want to have multiple LUNs for that. In our case here, we're using just a single LUN. Want to make sure that your drivers and firmware are up to date for your SAN or for whatever storage device you're using. I was talking to some people the other day that actually lost 2 days trying to figure out and troubleshoot their issues with their SAN. And ultimately it came down to that they didn't have the latest version of the drivers installed. So it's just a huge amount of time that was lost, and all they really needed to do is just make sure they had the right driver version. So definitely check on that, make sure you're up to date. And then make sure you don't share the witness or VHD LUNs with servers that are outside of your cluster. So you just want to make sure that that's locked down and only those nodes that are part of the cluster have access to write to those LUNs. And you can use either iSCSI, Fiber Channel, or serial attached SCSI storage. And then I would definitely recommend looking at using multipath I/O for high availability. And I've provided a shortened hyperlink URL there where you can go and check out more information about multipath I/O. But basically, multipath I/O allows you to set up multiple network adapters, cables, switches, etc. between the nodes of the cluster and the storage, such that if any one of those points fails, there's multiple paths for the server to get to the storage. So that's a good hardware redundancy implementation to have. All right. So now let's go on and we'll take a look at enabling virtualization in the BIOS. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is, as you go to each of these nodes of the cluster, is you need to make sure that each server that you're using in the cluster is ready to run Hyper-V. Pretty much any server sold in the last 6 or 7 years probably has all the necessary technology there, but in some cases you may need to make sure that it's enabled. So this is just a screen capture of where you would go in the BIOS to turn on Intel VT, and you also need to make sure that the data execution prevention bit is flipped on. So there's this is called an NX bit, a non-execute bit in AMD, or an execute disable bit in Intel platforms. So those are settings that you do inside of the BIOS before you even fire up the operating system and install it. So in terms of preparing the host operating system, you would install Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1 x64, and in order to do a Hyper-V cluster, you need to use either the Enterprise or Data Center edition of Windows Server. The standard edition of Server cannot be used for a Hyper-V cluster, although you can run just Hyper-V as a single standalone instance using standard. You'll want to install the operating system on some local volume on the physical server. I recommend using a RAID 1 configuration for disk drive redundancy there. And then make sure that you present the drives from the SAN to the host OS, and then go into disk management and bring each of those disks online, format each of those disks using NTFS. Just keep in mind that this is a shared disk amongst the nodes of the cluster, so you only need to do this one time within the cluster. So just do it on the first node and format it once. You don't need to format it again for each server. And then make sure that you use basic disks and not dynamic disks. And then you can either use a master boot record or a GUID partition table partition style. And then obviously you need to join the computers to the domain. And at that point, you've got your host operating system prepared to deploy Hyper-V. Okay, so the next step at this point is to just go through the add role wizard and install Hyper-V. It actually is something that if you had multiple nodes in the cluster, like if you were doing a 4 or 8 node cluster or something like this would actually be much easier to do using PowerShell. You can use PowerShell commandlets to install roles and features. So it'd be worthwhile to just look up what that command line is to do that, and then just remotely execute that command on each of the servers in the cluster rather than logging in and going through the add role wizard. That'd be much faster. It does require a reboot, and you'll need to install the Hyper-V role on each of the nodes of the cluster. And then once you've done that, then inside of Hyper-V, you'll want to create an external virtual network that uses one of the physical network adapters inside of the server, so that you've got each of your virtual machines can join out to the external network as well. And you want to make sure that the network configuration is the same on each of your Hyper-V servers in the cluster. The next step then would be to use the Add Features wizard to install the failover clustering feature. So again, this is something you can do through the command line using PowerShell, and would be much faster if you were doing more than just a couple nodes of the cluster. So this is again really easy. It's just kind of go through the wizard, check the box, click next, and it'll install the failover clustering feature. Once you've got that done, then you fire up the Failover Cluster Manager under the Admin Tools in the Start menu. And there'll be sort of a splash screen there with some different tasks and things that you can do. In the center section of that screen, you'll see a management section where you can click on Validated Configuration. Now, Validated Configuration is a simple wizard that you walk through to test to make sure that your server meets all of the requirements in order to create a cluster. So it'll check your storage configuration, your network configuration, what version of the operating system you're using, and so on and so on. And it'll also check to make sure that there's parity between each of the nodes that are proposed to be in the cluster, make sure they're on the same patch level and that sort of thing, to make sure that when you do actually go to create a cluster, it'll be a seamless experience. So if any issues crop up during that test, just to resolve those and then rerun the configuration test again. And once that's all green, then you can move on to the next step. The next step is to actually create the cluster. So you just click on the next link down where it says create a cluster, and you go through that wizard. It's a very short wizard. It basically asks you which computers do you want to include in the cluster. You give your cluster a name. In this case, we're going to call it VM host class, and a IP address. You can either use a dynamic IP address or a static IP address. And once you've got that done, that'll actually create the cluster. And then you want to right-click on the cluster name in the Failover Cluster Manager console there and choose Enable Cluster Shared Volumes. Now, cluster shared volumes are a neat feature because what it does is it basically says that any node in a cluster is allowed to read and write from files that are on that volume. So this allows us to do virtual machine live migrations from one node of a Hyper-V cluster to another. So this is sort of a critical feature to turn on if you want to be able to do live migrations. So you just click on that, it'll enable it. Once you've done that, there'll be some new nodes that show up in the tree, and you can right-click on the cluster storage volumes node and choose Add Storage. And then you'll just select the non-quorum disks, which are going to be the disks that are going to host your VHD or virtual machine files. So it's, you don't need to add the quorum disk to the shared volumes. I don't even think it will let you, but you do want to add those volumes where you are going to be storing your virtual machine and VHD files at. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to pause there, and I didn't record a video of this particular step in the process, but if you want to, there's an excellent video out here at this shortened URL. And really everything you need to know about Hyper-V clustering is in this doc up on TechNet that you can go and check out as well. So with that, I'll just pause here and see if there's any questions. Just going to log into the question and answer portal here real quick. I have to log into that before we started here. Give me 1 second. Okay, the Q&A console is just about up down. Okay, so all right, so we've got let's see. Okay, so the first question here is, so far Windows Server 2008 R2SP1 lacks support from storage vendors upon CSV and multi-site cluster. How do we act in this situation, i.e. disaster recovery? So I guess the scenario here would be where you wanted to have multiple nodes that are in the same cluster, but they're separated into different geographical regions. That's definitely a challenge. I think what I would recommend there is setting up multiple clusters and using things like live migration to do that over the wire. Until we get the storage vendors to support this type of thing, we're just kind of going to have to use less ideal approaches to that. So, okay, let's take the next question here. Okay, actually we're sort of out of questions here. We had one which was, can you elaborate on what is cluster shared volume? But I think we've talked about that. So basically a cluster shared volume is just a volume that is typically presented from a storage solution like a SAN, and it's shared amongst all of the nodes in that cluster. in the sense that all of the nodes in that cluster are allowed to read and write from any file on that volume. So that's what a clustered shared volume is, and that's critically important to enable live migration within a Hyper-V cluster. Okay, so that's the end of the questions so far, so I'll return back now to the slide and we'll keep going. So now we'll talk about creating a SQL and file server cluster. I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with doing this kind of thing, so I'll just make a couple of notes here. Just a reminder to use SQL Server 2008 R2 SP1 Standard or Enterprise x64. And you can just cluster the server using standard SQL Server clustering. I provided a shortened hyperlink there to the TechNet documentation on how to create a SQL cluster. And just make sure that you carve out LUNs on the SAN for the DB and data log files, and then assign drive letters to those, bring them online, that kind of thing, so that later on you can store your SQL Server databases and their associated log files on those LUNs. And then also you need to create a file server cluster if you don't already have one, where you can store the virtual machine manager library files. So this would be things like virtual machine templates, VHD drives, these types of things that are part of the library. And you can do that using a standard Windows file server role. So there's a shortened hyperlink there that goes and describes how to do that. And in this case here, I just created a LUN on the SAN and presented that out to the file server cluster in order to store the library files on there. Okay, so not really rocket science there. I'm sure most of you have set up SQL clusters many, many times, so there's really nothing any different there other than just making sure that you use the right version of SQL Server Standard or Enterprise, and also making sure that you use the right SQL Server collation based on the information I provided in the first session. So with that, we'll now go on to creating a VMM server cluster. And in order to sort of prepare to install a high availability VMM server, there's a few things you need to do. The first one is just simply to create a VMM service account in Active Directory. And then Virtual Machine Manager uses a asymmetric public key encryption design. And so what that means is that you've got multiple virtual machine managers. They're encrypting data, and since we have multiple servers, they need to be able to share a common public encryption key, and that key needs to be stored directly. So the way that we have implemented this is that we store that key in Active Directory, and ACL it down such that the VMM service account has access to that, and that way it can read it and understand what the key is, and then encrypt and decrypt the data using that key. So what you need to do in order to enable this for a high availability VMM server is you need to create a container in Active Directory and then ACL that down to the service account. I'll show you exactly how to do that here in just a minute, but it's probably something you'll need to work with your Active Directory administrator on. Then you need to install the prerequisite software on all of the nodes in the cluster. That includes the SQL Server 2008 R2 native client, SQL Server 2008 R2 command line utilities. These are just a couple of utilities that you can download off of TechNet, and the Wake, so the Windows Automated Installer Kit. And then lastly is just to add the service account that you created in the first step up there as an admin on all of the nodes in the cluster. So with that, I'll just show you a demo of how to do these things. So I'll share out my desktop here, and once that shows up, I'll start the demo video that shows you how to do this. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that now, and I'll just go ahead and start this video and walk you kind of through the process here. Keep in mind that, as with the other demo videos I've shown, I have cut out sort of a lot of the wait times and that kind of thing. So you can see here that I've got a service account that I've created in Active Directory. It's called SVC's SCVMM. And now I'm going to open up ADSI Edit, and I'm now in the Contoso domain root here, and I right-clicked on that root, and I just said Create New Object, and you can see here that I'm selecting to create a container object, and I give it a name. So in this case, I call it VMM DKM, Distributed Key Management. You can call it whatever you want. Click Next and Finish. And I expand it out and I right-click on that new container that I just created. Go into Properties, go to Security, and add the service account that I created in the first step. So SVC SCVMM. Add that in, grant that account full control on this container, click Advanced. Select that account again and click Edit. And here I'm going to change that so that it applies to this object and all descendant objects. Click OK, OK, and we're done with creating that special container in Active Directory. So just again, a recap, create a service account in Active Directory, create a container where we're going to store the public encryption key, ACL that container down to the service account. Pretty basic stuff, but it does require kind of special permissions in Active Directory, so you may want to work with your AD administrator to do that. Okay, now I'm going to show you the next part, which is how to configure the server and install the cluster on it. So we'll just fire up the next video here. And in this part here, I'm going through the process of installing the SQL Server 2008 R2 command line utilities. So you can find this up on the TechNet Download Center. And this is just a real quick utility that you install. Alright, so just accept the license agreement, provide name and company, install. Super simple. Done. Now we're going to install the next prerequisite, which is the Windows 7 Windows Automated Installation Kit. And this is also something you can download off of TechNet. So this is just a real quick install. Looks like I accidentally maybe cut out the native command line utilities that you also need to install here. Okay, so once you've got that installed, then kind of the last step to prepare the server is just to make sure that you add the service account as a local administrator on each node of the cluster. So just to recap, you install those three pieces of prerequisite software, add the service account as an admin on each node of the cluster, and that's something you need to do on each node of the cluster. Install that software, add the user. Okay, now we're going to start the virtual machine manager installer. I'll just fire this up. And in here we're going to say that we want to install the VMM management server. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing to note right here. The virtual machine manager setup will detect that you are running setup on a cluster node. And if you are, then it'll prompt you whether or not you want to install this as a clustered virtual machine manager server. So in this case, I'm going to click yes. Next. And here we just provide standard product information, accept the license agreement, opt in or out of the customer experience improvement program, opt in or out of Microsoft Update, choose the installation location. Okay, now here we're going to provide the SQL Server cluster name, not one of the nodes of the cluster, but the actual cluster name, so that it'll always try to connect to the cluster and use whichever node in that cluster is active. So here I'll change the server name to SQL Clus, which is the name that I gave to my SQL cluster. And then you can choose which instance to install it on, what the database name is going to be, and so on. Okay, and here we're going to provide a IP address for our cluster. So in this case, I gave it a static IP address here, and then you give your cluster a name. All right, so VMM cluster is the name. And then here we enter in what the service account is that we created in Active Directory, and we type in the distinguished name of the container where we created that container in Active Directory. So, you know, this would say CN equals VMM DKM or whatever it is. DC equals Contoso, DC equals com, right? So that's kind of pretty straightforward there. Here we can choose the ports that we want to install on that previous screen for the different components. Here we're choosing where we want to put the library share. I'm just skipping over this for now, and we'll add it in using the console later. And then we install. So this is, again, just on the first node of the clusters. We go through and do this. Once that's done, we then go over to the second node of the cluster and do the same requisite steps, and then run the virtual machine manager setup again. Except the experience this time will be a little different. So, as before, it detects that we're installing a cluster. We want to make this part of the highly available cluster, provide the product information, accept the EULA, customer experience, and Microsoft update again, as we saw before, and installation directory. And now you'll notice this time that this page, all of the controls on it are disabled. So it's discovered where the first node of the cluster is already communicating with in terms of which SQL server it's talking to and which database it's using. So we can just skip over this screen. And here it has already detected what the service account is. It already knows where the container is in Active Directory. So all we have to do is provide the credentials so that it can create the Windows servers here on the local server. You just give it the password there. And the port numbers need to remain the same. Virtual machine, or the library will remain the same. And at this point, we have installed the virtual machine manager cluster. So it's really pretty straightforward. Once you get all the prerequisites installed and that kind of thing, actually installing the cluster is pretty straightforward. So with that, let me just see if there are any additional questions here in the Q&A panel. Okay. Okay, what rights should the SCVMM service account have across my AD infra? So it's not really necessary for your SCVMM service account to have any particular permissions other than what I showed you today. So it needs to have the permissions that I showed, the full control on the container and everything underneath that container, as we configured in Active Directory for the distributed key management. And then it needs to be a local administrator on the virtual machine manager cluster nodes. And in order to deploy VMM agents to hosts, you'll have an option of whether you want to use the VMM service account or if you want to provide a different run as account to do that with. So if you want to use the VMM service account, you could make that a administrator on the virtual machine host where you want to deploy the VMM agent to, but that's not necessary. Okay, next question is, how can I see the last two events that I lost? So if you, okay, so they've already provided the link. So looks like I've got some helpers out there that are answering the questions as they come in. Let's see if there's any other questions that pop up in the queue. If not, we'll go back now to the PowerPoint. So this session today is a relatively short session, but during this session, we've effectively provisioned out our VM host cluster. We've installed the file server cluster. We've installed the SQL cluster. We've installed the VMM cluster and deployed all that. And we now have our virtual machine database running on that SQL cluster that is running out here on the SAN. Okay, now the next steps, we will, in the next session, we'll configure Virtual Machine Manager. So we'll deploy out agents to the virtual machine host cluster nodes. We will add that host cluster into Virtual Machine Manager. We'll create a host group. We'll add the library server. We'll configure some virtual networks, and we'll create a cloud. So this will be kind of putting in place all of the fabric management pieces inside of the Virtual Machine Manager console, so that we can then use that to deploy out virtual machines and manage them. So that's the next session. That'll be on Thursday, so just 2 days from now, again at 11 o'clock a.m. Pacific time. If there are any other questions, I'll take those now in the Q&A panel here. And if not, then I will see you guys on Thursday. Okay, so usually it takes somewhere around 24 to 48 hours for the TechNet team to produce these, and then they're available to view on demand by going back to the same URL where you registered for the event. So, and if you just search for Bare Metal to Private Cloud on the web, you'll find several blog posts that have kind of announced the series, and they have the whole series kind of laid out and hyperlinks to where to go to register for each session or view the ones that have already occurred. Okay, so next question here is, can you install, configure SCVMM cluster using PowerShell scripts? I don't know that we don't have exactly like PowerShell commandlets to do the installation, but our setups are enabled with command line parameters that you can use. So you can install the cluster doing it that way. Let's see. Next question. Once you get everything built, can you generate some sort of report with all the specific settings that were used in setting up the cluster, or do you need to write it down as you go? I don't know of any sort of handy way to do that. So I usually write it down as I go. There's really not a whole lot to write down. I mean, you kind of need to keep track of what volume letters you've assigned to each volume, what the IP addresses are, what the cluster names are, and so on. But it's not a whole lot. It's not a big pain to keep track of that as you go along. Okay, question is, am I going to be in Seattle for the TAP airlift? Possibly. I'm planning on it, but I'm also trying to move this summer, so it's getting a little crazy for me personally. All right, so don't see any other questions in the queue here, so I will see you all in a couple days here for the next session where we configure a virtual machine manager. Thanks for joining in today. Have a good one.